Now Catherine is going to introduce Adnan. Thank you and very welcome to this workshop, everyone.
Yes, I'm very pleased and honored that I can introduce my colleague Adnan Mahmutovic, who I've been fascinating with, like in terms of his work on transcultural, translingual, creative writing, and I think it fits really well into our network and today's talks. So Adnan is not only an associate professor and lecturer in English literature and creative writing at Stockholm University, but also an author of fictional work. Interestingly, he quotes himself also as a Bosnian-Swedish author who publishes in English. So we've got lots of aspects here. He's published widely, just to mention a few academic works in for instance, in the Journal of Post-Colonial Cultures and Societies, or the Journal of Contemporary Literature, monographs on literary criticism called The Ways of Being Free. Then he's co-edited a volume on visions of the future in comics. He also edited or co-wrote a volume on pedagogy of the creative editing, or the craft of editing. And for his fiction work, for instance, he published 2 novels. One is called Thinner Than Hair, and the other one, At the Feet of Mothers. So we have cross-genre, cross-everything, trans-everything. So I think I don't need to say anymore. Thank you very much, Adnan, for giving the talk today, and we're looking forward to the talk.
Well, thank you so very much for inviting me to this to do this plenary as an author and not an academic. I really appreciated that, and in fact, you know, I listened to the talk this morning, and obviously, you know, I'm pleased I'm not going to go into that kind of analytical mode, but this will be a kind of a reflection on some 20 years of writing, which takes me through several metamorphoses of writing, which is multilingual and transnational at the kind of a deeper level. So the title is To the Word, Words and Back. And I want to talk about multilingual writing as a kind of a state of being. You see, I used to be the kind of person who didn't believe one could learn different languages. So I spent kind of 6 years learning German, and in the end, I couldn't speak it to save my life. So until I learned Swedish, which is probably the easiest language in the world, you know, I didn't really quite get, you know, how you could, you know, use multiple languages. And, you know, Swedish is, let's just say, it's not the kind of language in which errors will lead you to insult someone's mother. I think that's a fair description of Swedish. Multilingualism of writing doesn't merely come from the fact of an author knowing and working in different languages. In my case, it's 3 languages, so it's English, Swedish, and Bosnian. But I want to argue in this kind of reflection is that multilingualism comes also from specific geographical locations, which in themselves contain kind of certain multilingualism and histories of languages. So in the examples that I'm going to give you, hoping basically to take you from the woods of my childhood onto buses and through cemeteries into the woods of the Smoky Mountains, and finally to the word woods of the mind, I will not necessarily draw your attention to the these kinds of obvious things like, you know, code switching, things that are most kind of visually conspicuous and you know, visible. So I'll try to talk about the movements in places, and I hope you can see in the excerpts how those places kind of shape language, shape the style, shape rhythms, shape character, shape structure. My kind of basic assumption, at least from my own point of view, my own experience, is when it comes to multilingual writing, the general way of working for me is by osmosis and through a kind of a mutual cohabitation and less a kind of a deliberate mixing of languages. So we'll see a couple of examples there. Catherine mentioned some of my works. I just wanted to show you this image. So this is some 15 years of publishing from the very early collection of short stories on refugee life to over the first novel, then the second collection, and last year's novel, which took me away from Bosnia and into America, into North Carolina, the woods of North Carolina. I'm just going to, yes. So much depends on the wheelbarrow. I think you recognize this image, you recognize it from a poem. As the poet said, you know, everything depends on the wheelbarrow. And in fact, very early on, and this is from an essay which I wrote, an autobiographical essay which was published in 2016. It's called How to Save Comics in Times of War. What happens in this story is it tells of that early stage during the war, just at the beginning of the war, when I was so worried that the soldiers would destroy my comic book collections. Yeah, no, I had an impressive comic book collection and I loved it so much. So I was really afraid. I wasn't afraid, you know, that I would lose, you know, my life or whatever. But my comics, you know, I needed to save them so desperately. So what I did was I had this idea that I would just put them on a wheelbarrow and drive them to the woods somewhere. So this is in the 90s in Bosnia. And I wanted to hide my comics in the woods because the woods for me were like home, the safest place. But when this friend of mine and I, when we got there and when we realized, well, all we could see was a bunch of trees and every spot was a hiding place. Basically, no spot was the right place. We were kind of lost in the woods. So we had this really brilliant idea that we would hide our comics in a septic tank instead. So in a shithole, basically. So what I'm trying to say here is that you see this movement in my first stories. It is a movement which in one shape or another kind of remains throughout my writing. And it is this movement of the wheelbarrow between the woods and the septic tank. So those are the places which somehow kind of defined how my stories got shaped. Ernest Hemingway, when he wrote A Movable Feast, this is one of his most famous books, he said actually that he said something that really resonated with me, something that I feel is true for myself, except in one case, and that is that you cannot write about one place while you are in that place, while you live in that place. You kind of have to move away. So he said when he was in the States, he could write about Paris and Europe and so on, but while he was in Paris, he could write about America and so on. So you had to kind of move away, and you need to let the places to permutate in the imagination, so that they can be made into narrative. And this, I suggest, is true for multilingual writing. So multilingual writing for me is composed of the woods with the wheelbarrows, the buses, the cemeteries, the septic tanks, all those images. And above all, it is this very movement of language which is shaped by those places and objects. So when you read A Movable Feast, it reads so effortless, like it's like he just sat down and wrote this. But we know it took him at least a decade, I think. And we see in the start, the movement of the language is the effect of a kind of simultaneous immovability of the place and the movement of the weather. It goes a little bit like this. So, then there was the bad weather. It would come in one day when the fall was over. We would have to shut the windows in the night against the rain, and the cold wind would strip the leaves from the trees in the place Kontriska. The leaves lay sodden in the rain, and the wind drove the rain against the big green autobus at the terminal, and the Café de Amateur was crowded, and the windows misted over from the heat and the smoke inside. It was a sad, evilly run cafe where the drunkards of the quarter crowded together, and I kept away from it because of the smell of dirty bodies and the sour smell of drunkenness. What's interesting about Hemingway is that he also speaks about the writing which shaped this writing. So he spoke about people like Knut Hamsun and the Russians, and how those kinds of other languages shaped his English. It's not something we necessarily think of when we read Hemingway, and we don't necessarily always see the transnational, we don't always see the multilingual, but it's really there. It's working at a very core of the craft in this story. So when then I wrote this piece myself, which is called A Movable Fast, which is actually a story. So it's my autobiographical essay where basically I'm telling the story of spending a Ramadan one summer in Bosnia, but I'm kind of missing our Scandinavian Ramadans. And here in this story, which takes place as I'm kind of transitioning into my 40s, entering a kind of new phase of writing, we see how the linguistic features that Hemingway inherited from Hamsun and Tolstoy and so on kind of seep into my story. So the implied influences of the Russian literature, for instance, vis-a-vis my mother tongue Bosnian and literature in Bosnian cannot be overlooked, I think. But it's coming to me also through Hemingway's English. So, so in a sense, we have here another wheelbarrow of a story that moves between the Balkans and Scandinavia via English, which is inspired, among other things, by Russian classics. So what I'm trying to say is that for me, the multilingualism aligns at a much deeper level. That it's not easy to analyze quite kind of mechanically, grammatically, lexically, and so on. Here, I'll read you just a little bit from the beginning of the story. Then the hot weather came to Sweden in 2014, as if the age of Nordic summers was gone and the monotheistic hell had decided to move closer to me now that I was about to turn 40. And it was Ramadan, falling this year in the period of shortest nights, beginning just before the most important national holiday, Midsummer Eve, when we eat crayfish, dance around straw goats with red ribbons, drink and sing snapsvisor, anything from Helan Gore and the Little Herring Set to Bumsy the Dirty Little Bear, whose lyrics have cues when everyone is supposed to drink up the shots. What I want to get at to begin with here is that multilingualism for me is also some kind of a non-lingualism. When we speak of the kind of richness of knowing a lot of languages, we tend to forget that for most of us working in various languages, that there is this dominant underlying myth of non-lingualism. That's like having no language to speak of. So being kind of a jack of all trades, but kind of supposed master of none. Or we could say that we are master jacks, if that makes any sense. So we have to be kind of on the very top of our game to even be in the game. And even then, kind of prejudices and suspicions abound. So knowing just a lot of languages and using a lot of languages also, and you will see towards the end of this lecture when I get to the word woods, how this non-lingualism is haunting the writing in itself. As promised, I wanted to I said I would start with the woods, and then I wanted to talk about buses. And I wanted to use the image of a refugee bus. This is just an image of a random bus. Because a lot of the stories and the language itself, as we moved as refugees, as we moved across borders through Europe, looking for a place to stay, everything was changing and everything was being shaped as we went on this journey. So I can tell that a lot of stories have been defined by this movement of these buses. So aside from the general sense of being lost among trees, so see, the entire Europe was like the woods one was trying to see, but perhaps not able to do for all the individual trees, if that makes sense. So if you say, okay, what is Europe as the woods? Well, what are all the individual trees that make it impossible for us to see these woods, which I see as home? The thing is that these refugee buses, they did not go from from bus stop to bus stop, but there were these stops, which were not stations. They were random resting places for toilet breaks or things like that, consistently governed, in my case, the structure of my stories. And I feel that I still struggle with that, still struggle finding forms that have beginnings and middles and ends. So in this story, How to Fare Well and Stay Fair, I deliberately use this sense of these random stops. So what we have is an essay in which there is a clear drive, and it is super clear there is a destination because the story is told from the point of view of someone stationed in a place, here, Sweden, telling a story as some kind of a instruction manual. So my older voice is instructing my younger self how to be the best refugee. And yet, though there is this destination from which the speaker sends these instructions into the past, it's still not quite clear if the voice really is speaking from the woods, from a home, or from just a place among a bunch of trees, or, as you will see shortly, from a bunch of graves. Again, to say it more perhaps explicitly, multilingualism, which I deal with, which I feel is at the core of my writing, is always a question of seeing the woods for the trees and cemeteries for the graves. Here is a place which many of you who live in Stockholm will recognize. Basically, this is how it works. The story about Ramadan, which I mentioned earlier, and all those summers in Bosnia, made me realize that I'm kind of attracted to graveyards. So in Bosnia, after Ramadan, on the second day of Eid, there is this post-war tradition to visit cemeteries. So every time, a bunch of people would gather and walk from one graveyard to another, offering prayers. So what I discovered was that there were these smaller graveyards in people's private backyards, which was real like, okay, there's a swing and there is a couple of gravestones. Then there were these places where there were no gravestones at all, but the locals knew there were graves there. It could be in the middle of a crossing. And they would stop there and they would visit these grave sites. So this kind of stuff, this kind of closeness to death, this relaxed attitude to the dead is not something I'd noticed as a kid. It was only as a kind of a returnee with Scandinavian eyes that I could see it. So despite the fact that I agree with Hemingway, the only place I used in a story while still living close to it is the graveyard around Katarina Kyrka. It is quite a special place. It's like a park. I pass through this so often, like at least on a weekly basis. As a student, I used to sit here and read books and eat my kebab and so on. It is open to the public. And sometimes you see these Swedish girls sunbathing among the graves. Don't get me wrong, I have no prejudice against naked girls in graveyards. But you understand how this gives the location a unique character and also how it calls for an entirely different kind of language. Just love this place, one of my absolute favorite places. So I used it in a story which is called Ghusl, and it means ritual washing. In this story is structured in a way that it starts at Katarina Kyrka, that graveyard, with the protagonist, Emina, who is working, as it says here, but her work, the autistic boy Stig, is scuttling from gravestone to gravestone around Stockholm's Katarina Church, knocking over aluminum vases and yellow flowers, his long blonde hair wet and glued to his face. He sings the latest Swedish hit that bombed at the Eurovision Song Contest. I wanna be like a star, like a hero, love will survive. You see in this description that follows that the graveyards, the graves are marked by the professions of the people who are there. The great Eric the Smithy and Irma the Milkmaid and so on and so on. So what we have is a place. So we have an opening of a story which is pretty much like a gravestone, but there is a lot of movement in that place. And that's reflected in the language, this kind of there's a sense of stability and the sense of movement and kind of disrespect, perhaps. And then we have the middle of the story, which is like a limbo of sorts, where her mother dies and needs to be buried. The story then ends at Skogskyrkogården, the Muslim section of the Kyrkogården. So it's like from graveyard to graveyard, from one gravestone to gravestone. The middle story is kind of bracketed or walled off by these two gravestones, these two places. And the beginning mirrors the end, or the ending mirrors the ending in structure, in language, all of it. except there are certain differences. So you see here that the Skogskyrkogården has these graves marked by nationality or ethnicity and not profession as the first one, but still we have Stig, who is moving through this graveyard in a very relaxed way, just as it's his playground, playing his Spider-Man, doing his Spider-Man impression. The reason I'm drawing your attention to graveyards here is that later on, when I started working on my novel At the Feet of Mothers, certain things followed: the woods and the graveyards. So the woods of Bosnia, for instance, in the first image, the woods of North Carolina, the Smoky Mountains. I think it's kind of funny that that graveyard was called Skogskyrkogården, so it's like woods churchyard. In this novel, At the Feet of Mothers, I would go through several cemeteries in North Carolina, in Gaza, random grave sites in the woods, in the Negev desert. They became very central to the shaping of this American story. And in that story, I was working with a very distinct local dialect, which was somewhat adapted for global readership. So not too obscure, but with enough locality. Perhaps similarly to what Stefan showed this morning, I actually had some old songs in some Indian languages, in Native American languages of the Smoky Mountains. That's perhaps the most conspicuous part. But I see how the woods and the graveyards followed me to this story. Again, kind of carrying over everything I had done until that point, even though I was focusing on making this story as local and as American as possible, and you will see some examples of that. So in the first novel, Thinner Than a Hair, there were quite a few references to the woods. They were really important. Here are just a couple of examples. For instance, we appeared in the fresh midnight light of the twin crescent moons, one sickle for each of us, and disappeared into the mountain woods. The woods and the night don't discriminate between people. And then there was this passage which I always liked. I'm going to get a life worth living with modern people in Europe, where people don't fight but have fun instead. Where? Germany or Austria, any place is better than this, where everybody hates you. I'll go somewhere where you only walk in the woods for sport. Germany and Austria were these promised lands for us Bosnians. They still are. We still have this kind of fetish for everything German, and so it's very much there. Now, At the Feet of Mothers, which took me quite a few years to finish, because I was really trying to get not just the story but also the language. Here is an example from one chapter, just to give you a sense of the way the style of writing, kind of how the woods are always there in the language itself. How the character of Joseph, the woods are always with him, whether he is in a desert, on a freighter, the open sea. So it's always evoking this sense of being at home in the woods, always trying to see the woods for the trees. This particular passage is, I think, interesting, and you'll see here the rhythms of the language that reflect this. The wind was slow and patient. I leaned on the old poplar of a caddie's grave and slowly sank down to the ground and felt the moss and touched a few new plants. I sat down and waited for the cold to seek its way into my muscles, and then I stood up and rubbed my legs and walked on. I followed the edge of the woods, thinking the smooth darkness to my left must be at least 5 yards deep. No sounds came from it. The hooting and rustling and screeching and gnawing and breaking and twirling came from the trees and swept over the dark and into the trees on the other side, which then answered with a vengeance. And now that I no longer sought any sense in the ancient row between the plants and animals, it was all clear to me and plain, like the wind that kept blowing at the same pace, still strong and still patient. I picked a star and followed it. It was a puny star, whose name I didn't know, and I didn't care which way it led me. I was hungry, so I sang the bear song, but no bears came. I was not afraid of anything, save myself. I didn't include here the passage with the bear song, which is in a different language, which he uses. There are the rhythms of that language also included here. I thought it would be perhaps too much of the kind of the visual. I just wanted you to see how the rhythms of the language here are shaped by this need to, this locality of the linguistic and the geographical locality of this place in North Carolina. Now, towards the end of the novel, this is basically the very end of it, I want to make a point about, again, these linguistic influences which are carried over from, from one language to another and so on. It's very hard to kind of, for you to see, but I need you to take my word for it, and I'll show you another passage from another book here to compare it a little bit, so perhaps you can see just a little bit of it. So if you look at this this passage, so this is Joseph speaking. I closed my eye thinking, so what were they then, my mothers? Mad women, wretches, the most complicated women on the face of the earth. History hasn't played a joke on anyone like it has on them, on us. And what the hell am I? Until yesterday, I'd been what I wanted to forget today, but today I didn't become anything else. I finished my path stunned. I'd been torn from my roots twice, but I didn't become a part of anything else. Like a pilgrim whose course was diverted by a flood and no longer has a source or an estuary, too small to become a sea, and too big to be drunk up by this tough earth. With a feeble sense of guilt because of my origins and shame because of my ignorance, I felt detached from kin and strangers, and I didn't even have pride or hate to defend myself from these ghosts. I guess we, my mothers and I, wanted to save ourselves, but in the end we got lost. In the end, the tragedy was that we had loved this failure to grow roots and be a part of a people. And everything has its price, even this love. Was it a coincidence that it was so soft-hearted and cruel, my mothers, so damn sentimental and so damn hard, joyful and melancholy, always ready to surprise others and surprise themselves? Was it a coincidence that they have taught me, if despite themselves, how to hide behind this love, the only certainty in this mess, and find no reason to rage? Why did I do it? Why was I doing it? Because after all, I wasn't indifferent, because they weren't indifferent. And if you weren't indifferent, then maybe, just maybe, we'd always been honest, especially when we lied. And if you were honest, then please God, please salute our madness. So this story for me is American to the core, but it's also very transnational. This particular passage really specifically was modeled on a passage from Death and the Dervish by Nestor Selimovic. So if you read this passage, for instance, you will see that he's speaking about a people, he's speaking about a country. So I'm taking some of these thoughts and transporting them, but it's also the language itself, the rhythms of the language that I'm using from this book, for instance, and a number of other books, to inform the very American English, which is very local to the places I'm describing. It's not always perceptible, but it's there, and it's really interesting how well it fits. Just as, you know, when I was growing up, there were these songs I would listen to, and then later on I would discover, no, these were kind of copies of American songs, but for me they were kind of quintessentially Bosnian. So Death and the Dervish by Nestor Selimovic is a novel, is a classical novel, which is about a man who is kind of lost in the woods of his own mind. And you have to know his writing really well to see his influences from other languages like Russian, Arabic, Turkish, Persian, German, and so on. And all of these, through by this kind of osmosis, which I mentioned earlier, kind of seep into this and shape this American story that I worked on, and this research that I've done on the linguistics of that locality. Now, I want us to move from the Smoky Mountains to what I promised in the beginning, and that is the word woods. What is that? So I always liked playing with languages, but there's always been a kind of intent to create a connection and not obscurity. I feel that some of the examples we've seen this morning, for instance, there is a struggle, there is an attempt at intimacy, but there is also a disconnection, obscurity, and this because there is a problem with the languages. I didn't have that particular problem because, as I said in the beginning, my multilingualism was also non-lingualism. I didn't have the history of a colonial language behind me and so on. So for me, it was really quite different from, for instance, the examples we saw this morning. And it's my kind of general belief that we can speak the same language and master the same language and not understand each other at all, and speak different or multiple languages at the same time and create intimacy. I think that's something that I've experienced through my work. This is from an early story, The Origins of Smudges, where this is the very end of the story, where you have a little bit of this language play. The story ends with me kind of leaving a hospital in Turkey and being in a taxi. So it goes like this. The singing nurse wheeled me down to the reception, where they gave me a prescription for painkillers and called a cab. Turkish songs sounded like Bosnian songs. The driver picked up a German tourist with a sick girl who was going in the same direction. I said the music was nice, and he asked me in German how long I'd been hospitalized. I said in English, 5 out of 8 vacation days, and he turned to the German woman to ask her how to say Scheiße in English, and she said shit, and he said shit, and I said Scheiße, and he asked me for my name, and when I told him, he said, Adnan Turk? Nein. It was just a kind of a babel of languages in that hospital, and everything around it. I thought was really quite funny. But what I'm coming to here is something that will connect the beginning and the ending. Now you see, in recent years, I've been asked so many times to write these essays on language, and I never really expected that I'd have to reflect more explicitly like this. So I had this story from 2005 from the book called Refugee, and it's also in the 2012 collection. It's called Afterward Homecoming, where I'm telling this story about going back to Bosnia for the first time after the war, and experiencing certain weird things about language, and how this disconnection from the people who are supposed to speak the same language as I am, completely not understanding each other. It kind of reflects that those kind of Sartrean moments when, you know, no names fit anything, you know, no objects, like the word tree doesn't correspond to the actual tree, you know, nothing makes sense. So what happened was that years later, so this is in 2018, a woman from Serbia was working on a book called Life in Another Language. And it was going to be a collection of essays by authors working in languages that are not their mother tongues. But the story had to be in your mother tongue. I mean, the essay had to be in your mother tongue. So in my case, in Bosnian. So I panicked. I had not been writing in Bosnian, not at this level. So what I did was perhaps something which I felt represented my inner multilingualism or non-lingualism, some kind of, you know, grounding multilingualism that was always hiding under this nice veneer of all the stories that I've written. So what I did was I took this story, Afterward Homecoming, and I took a section from it and pulled it through Google Translate. And then I wrote an entire essay as a kind of a reflection on that machine translation. So this was really like diving deep into these word woods, really going crazy on this, like really exposing myself to Google's own multilingualism. Yeah, because in my view, what happened was that it showed more precisely what it meant to have more languages and yet perhaps no language at all. So what happened was basically, so I wrote this paper, this essay, which was, as you can see here, it's called Sasvim bez prokletstva. So that's and that actually doesn't make any sense in Bosnian. You know, it's a title that will probably confuse most people. It just doesn't make any sense. Well, what does that mean? Then what happened was that I was asked to translate that essay into English. Now, okay, well, that was really crazy. Okay, so how am I supposed to translate that where I let the Google Translate do a part of the essay, and then I have this reflection, and you know, just translating it back into English would make absolutely no sense. So it had to be a completely different creation. This is just the this is the cover of that book, which is in the Balkan languages. Now, what happened was that what I did was I used the same method. I took that essay and Google translated it back into English to see what will happen. And I was going to write a reflection on that machine translation. So I thought, okay, well, let's go crazy for real. Like, let's see what is going to happen. The very opening is not terribly controversial. I'll just read it to you so you get a sense how it opens. In each interview I've given since the beginning of my career, one question keeps creeping up. Why do you write in English and not in Bosnian, or at least in Swedish? My most honest answer is always, because my mother doesn't speak English. There is an all too intimate connection between a mother and a mother tongue, and I think Dr. Freud would have at least patted me on the shoulder, if not said, like a good old-fashioned father, well done, boy, you dodged that bullet. So this is the opening of that reflection. Now, here is the bit where the translation kind of got really interesting. I cannot show you the one in Bosnian and how crazy that one is. because you wouldn't be able to understand it. So what I'll do is I'll show you, this is the passage from the very end of that 2005 essay, which goes like this. And it's a reflection on this language and languagelessness. Now, back in the safe corridors of the English department in Stockholm, a linguist colleague tells me that babies are exposed to their mother tongues even in the womb. It is an uncanny thing, swimming in a language like in the amniotic fluid, then swimming out of it as if I have emerged from the ice-cold Scandinavian sea onto some a familiar shore, breathless and quite speechless, quite curseless. I see this story actually takes Shakespeare's Tempest and the story of the Caliban to speak about, having no language to curse in. This essay is about me going back to Bosnia and everyone is swearing and I have no idea how to swear. I can't use any invective. I just don't know how to do it. I'm completely out of this language and everyone else uses it on a very everyday kind of mundane basis. So quite curseless is a reference to the Caliban not being able to curse or learning to curse, to have some agency through language. So I translate this, Google Translate into Bosnian, reflect on it, and then I translate back. So you can imagine that this phrase, quite curseless, through Google Translate becomes and quite without damnation, you see? So this is like going through several Google Translates, quite curseless in the end becomes and quite without damnation. So you will see that the top bit is the very machine translation. It goes like this. When I returned to the fine and secure halls of the English department in Stockholm, my colleague told me that the babies were exposed in tongues, even in their subjects. Fantastic thing. Imagine, swim in the tongue like in the mother liquor, and then spill like a cold Scandinavian sea on an unknown shore, breathless and without tongue, quite frankly. You see, this is so funny. But at the same time, the mother liquor, for me, this was so brilliant, and this is from the essay. Quite frankly, there was some fun ingenuity in all this. It would take a certain kind of mind to call amniotic fluid mother liquor. Freud, stop laughing, please. What happens here is that these multilingual detours that took me from one point, 15 years earlier to this point were really quite remarkable. And I thought it was so, basically it was what I wanted to write originally in that essay, which is called Afterword, but it would have been entirely wrong because I would be too conscious. So what Google Translate actually helped me reach that point, that kind of place where I could justify this kind of play, which really reflected how I felt at the time. So it took me, as you see, one attempt, and then 15 years later, another attempt to capture that kind of a relation to language and writing. So coming out of these crazy word woods, this year I was commissioned another essay on language is coming out in a few weeks. It's called How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Trivas with Words. And here we have a new play, a new confidence. I'll show you a little bit of that. When I was rather new to Sweden, with only a few years of refugee life behind me, I worked in a group of care assistants, and when one of us died, we all went to his funeral. The priest pulled out an electric guitar and played a famous pop song by Ulf Lundell, Jag trivs bäst i öppna landskap. I was lost for words, of course, but quite enjoyed it. My first big culture clash. The main verse translates roughly as, I best enjoy being in vast landscapes. But the Swedish verb trivas really means to thrive, to grow, and in more everyday use, to feel good and at home. You can trivas at work or trivas with someone. It signifies that everything is just Swedish lagom, just enough, balanced. It doesn't ooze the intensity of strong love, but evokes a preferred mood or a mode of being. Perhaps it is like that line of Raymond Carver. In addition to being in love, we like each other and enjoy one another's company. I think there is a way to trivas with words, and for words to trivas with you, like you can trivas with someone you love. It hasn't always been like that. There is also a way to live with words that make the ground arid, a way to always and utterly distrust words. Here I'm coming out of the words with a new confidence. Finding this is also from the same essay, towards the end of the essay, where I speak about this prayer, which I found recently. A friend of mine actually wrote an essay on it. There is a prayer which is so popular in Bosnia. It's used in so many different contexts, in religious schools, in all kinds of contexts. Really, it is omnipresent somehow. Now, this prayer is called Bosnian prayer, but it's not Bosnian in origin. It actually started with the poetry of Tagore, probably fragments of his poetry, which traveled through translation into Arabic from Calcutta for an entire century, over many borders and open landscapes, transformed, as I write here, through different languages to the pen of a Bosnian translator, and became one of the most cited prayers in all kinds of official and private contexts. Now, the Bosnian prayer jumped into English, and from there it bounced back into the world and impressed people so much they called it by our name. And it is ours, and it is Tagore's, and it is yours, like all words. At least that's what the legend says. And so in the end, if I may think of a hope for a future, my idea of an eternal afterlife is not, as in some people's opinions, a life in a place where everyone speaks one and the same language, some dialect of the proto-father Adam, which encompasses all words that capture the essences of all things. Instead, it's an eternity spent learning millions of languages, getting to know each other, trivas for all eternity. I take this Bosnian prayer as a metaphor for this kind of osmosis, which I mentioned in the beginning, which I see lies at the core of my writing and my own, perhaps, multilingualism, if that's what we want to call it. I never know which language, which tradition kicks in those endless searches for phrasings and forms. I just feel more relaxed, just letting things happen. To me, through me. Sometimes there is a certain consciousness, sometimes mainly there's none. So in the end, so much, everything depends on that wheelbarrow. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that this was interesting to you. It was not academic, it was not analytical. I thought I would do some kind of a reflection on these few decades of writing life.
Thank you very much, Adnan. Indeed, I think I can speak for all of us here that it was very extremely insightful, this reflective piece, and I think it resonated maybe with our personal experience in a sense of being in between languages and non-lingualism, as you mentioned. And as Janus said previously, it also, of course, resonated with lots of our concepts that we're coming with. For me, it was maybe voice, very much in relation to power as well. But also, I think it related very nicely to our talk this morning, where I felt that you brought a more localized aspect to this concept of regimes of comprehensibility. It was very much about places and objects, and making that, bringing that into a language. So thank you very much for that. And I think we have a bit of time for questions and comments or other reflections. Anyone? Yes, it's better.